Senator McKenzie.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on General Business Notice Motion 953, that the Senate notes the Labor government's abject failure to support Australia's agriculture, fisheries and forestry industries, which make an important contribution to Australia's economic, social and environmental prosperity. They surely deserve a bit more support, along with the third of Australians who live in rural and regional Australia. The industries employ 332,000 people across our regions in full and part-time work. There's 134,000 farm businesses in Australia, with each Australian farmer producing enough food to feed 150 people locally and 450 people overseas. Our farm gate contributes 3% to Australia's total GDP, and our farmers export about 60% of their produce. It's been a big week of fishing. We've learnt a lot, I think, in the discussions and debates that have occurred in the Senate this week. I know I have. Our commercial and fishing and aquaculture industry is worth $2 billion annually, and the Australian fishing industry employs over 16,000 people. Senator Thorpe was mentioning the forestry industry. My own father began his business career as a logger in the early 1960s in a little town in regional Victoria called Marysville. But wood product industries are also pulling their weight despite the Green Labor policies of Tasmania. Their annual turnover is $22 billion. In 2006, they did employ 120,000 Australians, but that's much less now, thanks to successive state Labor governments. Senator Thorpe's commentary, I think, around forestry workers and how saddened she was to see them stand with John Howard in that classic meeting in Tasmania in the 2004 election. That's because the forestry workers actually chose jobs over the joke of the Labor government that was heading for there. And I think watching Mr Latham's subsequent behaviour after that election bears those workers' choice out. Anyway, it's hard not to agree with the business notice of motion before the Senate. The Labor government has forgotten regional Australia's key industry, and not just because of the dirty, big deal with their partners in government, the Greens. In the regions, our industries need a few things to thrive and prosper. They need water, they need certainty to invest, they need support to continue to export our clean green produce, and they need recognition from government that our way of life is inclusive. We consult. You don't mess with the fence unless you've had the chat to your neighbour. And let's face it, the ALP's track record on any of these key factors is failure. Firstly, on water, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan has the ability to pull the economic and social rug from under the community, and it's a thriving contributor to our Australian economy. The total agricultural production within the basin is worth $15 billion, and 2.1 people live in the basin. 900,000 are employed. The lack of confidence and certainty around the Basin Plan is affecting local investment and having significant social impacts. There needs to be more information on how water will be recovered. And I think we've been clear on our side, along with the community, because I've been to every public consultation in my home state of Victoria, that water recovery needs to be through infrastructure or environmental works, not buybacks. The plan to work it needs the states to cooperate, because the states are the ones that are actually going to be operating the system and developing detailed environmental watering plans. But the Gillard government's track record with the states is appalling, and so the lack of confidence continues. The ALP must admit its approach to water recovery thus far has been a disaster. They've spent $1.9 billion on water buybacks, but just $494 million on investments and infrastructure in the basin. For every 1 litre of water that's been saved through infrastructure, 5 litres has been taken out of communities through buybacks. If the government wants to recover water above the 2750 gigs, then it must commit that this comes at no additional economic cost to the communities. They can't afford it. Remember in 2010 when the government assembled the first draft of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan without any community or stakeholder consultation? We heard communities screaming out from Victoria right through up Griffiths. 1,000 people rallied in Mildura, angry over the lack of local input. And when we talk about how the ALP doesn't even understand how we live and work in the regions, they schedule those public consultations during harvest time in a place like Shepparton, where people are busy working in their business, trying to make a dollar, and haven't got the time to head off to listen to Tony Burke and Craig Knowles. The carbon tax, another great Labor Party policy, disproportionately affects regional communities. Dairy, hort, coal mining, transport, they're all major employers out in the regions. Despite the rhetoric of not being included, agriculture is right now battling the flow-on effects of the tax. Increased power prices and import costs on fertiliser and refrigeration. The processing and dairy sectors are battling. Energy-intensive sectors, some of the bigger ones, paying the carbon tax itself. Dairying again, the red meat industry will find it harder. Their heavy reliance on road transport will make it easier for competitors in New Zealand, Europe, South America, who are not facing the world's biggest carbon tax. Australia's produce reputation is a great one. We're very proud of our clean green record. It's how we want to keep it. But again, how's this government been supporting industry? Let's have a think. Whether it's apples, nursery products or the potato industry, the government's support in biosecurity and customs has been to ignore growers' concerns, increase cost and increase regulation. A future decision favouring New Zealand potato imports carries with it serious threat to Australia's $10 billion horticultural industry, an industry that employs over 60,000 people. New Zealand has been ravaged by the zebra chip disease, a bacterium that's spread by a psyllid insect and has caused an estimated loss of $200 million for their producers. Under a Labor government, growers can be uncertain of their biosecurity future. Science. I have a science degree, so I feel I can actually speak on this. Science must be a guiding factor when it comes to any decision being made around this magnitude, and a decision based on anything else is not acceptable when we're dealing with economic, social and environmental impacts of getting it wrong. It's not the first time the Gillard government has decided to ignore growers. Last year, the government gave the green light to import New Zealand apples, and I noticed Senator Heffernan has entered the chamber, a fantastic advocate for our horticultural industry. The only problem of being that fire blight has existed in New Zealand for almost 90 years, and during that time Australia has managed to keep it free of this damaging disease. Almost 90% of the pear industry is concentrated in my home state of Victoria in the Goulburn Valley. The industry is worth $200 million per annum and employs approximately 2,000 people. But Labor didn't listen to growers. We now have New Zealand apples in. The list continues. Regional development funds should focus on the government in supporting local communities to achieve local outcomes. But Minister Crean has frozen the Regional Development Fund. So where does that leave those communities who'd hoped to use the funds to revitalise their towns? The Australian newspaper confirmed the government would halt the $2 billion worth of grants. This is after slashing $400 million from the program over the past 2 years. So it's not just the current effort to deal with their current economic mismanagement that we're dealing with, but a sustained program of de-investment over time. Not that regional Australia under this government is defined in a way that accurately reflects what we, on this side, understand a region to be. When this Labor government under the Regional Development Program gives 80% of the money to cities, we have a problem, Houston, and so does Midiamo. One of the issues with this Labor government is that they're so desperate to be liked. They are also so desperate to be green. They are so desperate to be like the Greens. It means email campaigns and public pressures from the left, from inner urban elites, can cause catastrophic flip-flops in ministerial decision-making. There is no greater example of this than the live cattle export debacle. The cattlemen and their families are still dealing with the fallout in an industry that may never recover because Joe folded, because Julia couldn't take the heat. Even this week we've seen the ship of fools thrown science overboard, science underpinning how our fisheries are managed. When ministers can overturn the livelihoods of a minority because of an email campaign, something is seriously wrong with the democracy. Ministerial insecurity complexes have been a direct result of Labor's dance till the death with the Greens. Forming an alliance with the Australian Greens was always going to be bad news for regional Australia, and we know that. We tell the nation every time we get to vote. That's why the Greens' vote in Mallee is just a little over 7%, and it's why the Greens' vote in Murray, right across northern Victoria, was 6%. For every day that this government remains wedded to the Greens is another day that regional Australia continues to wonder if those in power can hear, because they're hypocrites, Mr Deputy Speaker. When Christine Milne acknowledges that rural Australia, and I quote, faces complex agricultural, environmental and social challenges, she's right. They're challenges that her own policies have created. Their policy on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan says otherwise. 4,000 gigs is what they would like to see go. That will have a catastrophic economic, social cost on the communities right throughout the basin. The Greens' food production policies say otherwise. Their economic management credentials say otherwise. They are all hope and no hard work. And out there in the regions, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is something we understand all too well. It's hard work. In closing, while this government supports a carbon tax, it cannot support the dairy industry. When this government doesn't support science, it can't support our fishing industry. And while this government supports locking up the forests, it cannot support our forest industry. And so when we look at our motion that we're debating today, the Senate notes the Labor government's abject failure to support Australia's agriculture, fisheries and forestry industries. The evidence is clear. This government cannot support agriculture, fishery and forestry industry because it's supported by the Greens.